this neuropsychologist, she said, has anybody ever talked to you about post-traumatic stress disorder? And I looked at her like, you crazy? You know, I'm not a Vietnam vet. I wasn't in Afghanistan having to deal with IEDs the whole time. And she said, when you have a stroke, when you have a heart attack, when you have something like that, it's a trauma, a significant trauma. And you need to do things in the therapy that also help you cope with that trauma.
This is the Recovery After Stroke podcast with Bill Gasiamis, helping you navigate recovery after stroke.
Hello and welcome to episode 226 of the Recovery After Stroke podcast. To learn more about my guests, including their links to social media and other pages, and to download a full transcript of the entire interview, please go to recoveryafterstroke.com/episodes. If you would like to support this podcast, the best way to do it is to leave a 5-star review and a few words about what the show means to you on iTunes and Spotify. If you're watching on YouTube, comment below the video, like the episode, and to get notifications of future episodes, subscribe to the show on the platform of your choice. My guest today is Peter Cass, who had a stroke that was linked to atrial fibrillation. 5 years down the road to recovery, Peter has had to overcome much and is getting help with anxiety as well as emotional recovery from stroke. Peter Cass, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Bill. Nice to be here in a virtual world, so to speak.
Nice to have you here all the way from Switzerland. What time is it there now?
It is just after 9 o'clock in the morning. So
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. And here it's 7 p.m. on Thursday. And that's quite a time difference.
It certainly is. It's a lot of fun when we do projects in Australia.
Tell me a little bit about what happened to you, though.
What happened to me was at the beginning of 2017. I was diagnosed as having an atrial fibrillation. And as you know, if you have that, your chance of having a stroke is increased by 5-fold, I think, something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I was given some regular medication. And in March 2017, on a Monday lunchtime, I just started to feel really bad and noticed that my atrial fibrillation was bad and my heart beat was all over the place. So I drove home, excused myself, and thought that the rest would sort that out. The following day, on the Tuesday, I spoke to my GP, and he then spoke to the cardiologist at the local hospital, the department that was dealing with me. And he said there's a possibility that we can give you what's called a pill in the pocket, which is a medication that will, break the cycle with your AF and bring you back to normal. So he said, okay, come in tomorrow and we'll sort that medication out for you. So I went in the morning, took the pills home with me and took the pills. But I was still kind of, working from home. So in the afternoon of the Wednesday, I was actually hosting a web conference. And suddenly I'm looking at the screen and I can't see the cursor when my mouse cursor is moving to the right. And I was presenting. And my first reaction, being an IT person, was think, oh, the driver's messed up or something doesn't work. So I didn't really, think about it. And then the meeting finished. And I really noticed that I couldn't see so well out of my right eye. So went and sat down, had a rest. And I thought to myself, this is interesting because I know these tablets that I was given and taken are strong. So I just took it easy, really. A mate of mine was coming around to watch the Champions League. So I decided that beer wasn't on the menu for me that night if I was feeling a bit dizzy. And when he came round, I got him to read the instructions, the leaflet that comes with the drugs, which is printed so small, it's hard to read, and I really couldn't read it, although my eyesight's pretty good. So he read it, and he saw that it said you could have as a side effect blurred vision, and you could also have slurred speech. So I didn't think too much about it. The next day, I called the doctor and I said, I'm having these problems. Do you think it could be the side effects of the medication or something else? And he said, yeah, it sounds like the side effects of the medication. And he said, then on the following day, if you're not feeling better, then come to the office. I won't be there, but someone else could look at you. My wife at lunchtime said to me, your speech is slurred sometimes. And I speak 2 languages. I'm obviously, our mother tongue is English, but I'm also speaking German. And with her, I speak English, and her English is very good. And I thought, yeah, this is interesting. I'm really looking forward to going to the doctor the following day, which I did. And I was seen straight away, saw another doctor. He did some tests with me, the typical stroke things like balance and that kind of thing. Right, you're going to hospital now, to emergency. I think you've had a stroke.
Right.
And of course, in my mind, I'm thinking stroke, half the body on fire, terrible pain, all these other things, because that's my kind of layman's knowledge at that point as to what a stroke is like. So I'm thinking, I can't have had a stroke. That cannot be that I had a stroke. So I went to the hospital and I had a scan, and then the neurologist showed me the damage on the pictures. And indeed, I had had a stroke probably on the Wednesday after I took those tablets.
Wow. So how old were you at the time?
How old was I? I'm 65 now, so I would have been 60.
Yeah.
Would have been 60.
Are you doing in your mind, after that amount of days elapsed, when you finally found out, are you kicking yourself? How are you responding to the fact that you waited so long to do something about it? Are you giving yourself a hard time? How does that go down?
Right. I think I was giving the doctors a hard time for the first opportunity. Of course, I said to myself, wow, I should have insisted on going to the doctor earlier, as soon as I had those symptoms. But, you tend to trust healthcare professionals. And I thought, if he says this is a possible side effect, then it probably was. And of course, actually, I met the cardiologist some months later, and he knew when I walked through the door I was going to ask him. I said, could the medication you gave me have caused the stroke? And his answer was in German, of course, but it's basically, Mr. Cass, you were very unlucky, because on very rare occasions, this drug can actually cause problems and loosen up, let's say, an embolism that you have in your heart. So I would say the likelihood, which is positive and negative, was that the medication caused the stroke. But I would never get that from the hospital or from the cardiologist in writing, of course.
Do you, in hindsight, do you wish that they had said that? And do you think that would have made a difference in your decision to take the medication if they'd made you aware of that potential risk?
It would have been a consideration. I mean, if I believe what I've read afterwards about that drug, it is a very, very rare occurrence, less than 1 in 1,000. So everything is a gamble when it comes to it, especially with medical treatment and with medication. As you know, you can only really go. I try to keep myself informed. I'm probably a pain in the rear end for doctors, because I also worked for pharmaceutical companies years ago. So I consider myself to have quite a good knowledge level. But yeah, maybe I'd have maybe I'd have thought about it. But I guess at that point in time, a stroke was a million miles away from my thoughts. It wasn't really something that I could consider would happen.
Had you ever known anybody to have had a stroke?
Actually, no. And of course, the funny thing is, well, not funny, in the last 5 years, you start to network with people. Actually, a very good friend of mine has had a very, very bad stroke. So I thank myself. I'm grateful every day, of course, that I didn't have anything serious. However, on the other hand, what I feel is that, a lot of people who have long-lasting physical problems as a result of having a stroke, it's much more serious. But when you have one of these silent strokes, the problem is no one understands it. Because, when I called up work and said, I've had a stroke, and it was like, can you walk? And when people came and visited me in hospital, I'd go and walk to the coffee area with them. And I think they found it hard to believe I'd had a stroke. And to be honest, in the beginning, before I understood more about it, I found it very difficult to believe that I'd had a stroke, because I'm in hospital in this stroke unit, wired up, monitored and everything. And besides a few problems with my heart and my blood pressure, I didn't feel, bad. I felt like a fraud, if that makes any sense. You're sort of thinking, well, it has this really happened? And of course, the evidence was there that it had happened. And then I started to notice what the problems were, at least in the short term.
Yeah, well, I can completely relate to that part. So my first incident was a bleed in the brain, and it took 7 days for me to go to the hospital. And I was walking differently, and my wife noticed it, and she told me about it, and I ignored it. And my chiropractor told me, and I ignored it. But when I finally went there, and they gave me some medication to decrease the inflammation in the head, I was up and about and walking normally, and you couldn't tell. I was in my football gear, and
When you say football, which kind of football? Because you have so many different types.
Round ball.
Round ball. So, yeah, okay. Association football. Game. Yeah. Good on you.
And of course, I wasn't in boots or anything, but just shorts and a t-shirt and running shoes. And then people would come to visit me, and I would be down with them in the cafeteria, and I'd be walking all over the hospital telling them what they're doing to me and all that. And people, you could tell they couldn't compute it because there was no visible signs. And I was being told constantly, stay in your bed. Do not wander around the hospital by the nurses, the doctors. They kept looking for me. They kept trying to bring me back. But I just didn't feel like I needed to be there. And I didn't realize how serious it was until 6 weeks later, when I was supposed to go to the follow-up appointment. A day before, I had another bleed, which was a little more catastrophic, a little more dramatic, where it was at the point where I didn't know my wife, who my wife was. I didn't know my name. So, and I had a long-winded recovery from that portion of the bleed. And the other thing with me was they never called it a stroke because it was technically a brain. It was an arteriovenous malformation, which is technically a tumor, which is inside your head, which bled. It's technically not an ischemic stroke, and it's not an exact hemorrhagic stroke. So for many years, they actually didn't call it a stroke, and I wasn't treated by the stroke department, if you like, or I wasn't in the stroke ward. And I couldn't relate to anybody because I didn't know where I fit in. I had all the neurological symptoms that stroke people had. I had a fatigue. I had all these things. And the first time I realized that I could say that I had a stroke, for lack of a better label, was when I read it on the Stroke Foundation, Australian Stroke Foundation page. That I had a brain hemorrhage, and they classify that as a hemorrhagic stroke. So when you're saying you felt like a fraud, I felt like I was explaining myself to people who weren't believing me, who downplayed the seriousness of it. And I couldn't convince them otherwise. And it was a really challenging thing to bring people on board so they can understand what neurological problems I was facing cognitively, emotionally, mentally, the whole gamut of issues, right? But
I can totally relate to that.
Yeah,
totally,
but I couldn't get people on board. So what were you left with when you were discharged from hospital, and how long did it take to get discharged?
Well, I was in hospital for 6 days. Of course, I mentioned the vision problem, but within 2 or 3 days, I was using my iPad, I was using my phone, sending texts and things straight away. But the right half, the vision on my right side, it was like someone just cut the screen about 20%, and that last 20%, I remember watching football, and whenever the ball got played from the left to the right, I was having to turn my head to follow the ball. It's normally you sit in front of the TV, and so there was definitely a vision problem. What I began to realize, however, soon after, and I didn't hear about asphasia for probably 2 years after my stroke, was that I was writing sentences in text or whatever, missing out words, using the wrong words, and that became very apparent. And also, I was struggling sometimes to read. I'll give you an example. Probably 2 days in, I was reading the BBC News on my phone, and I came across a word which I didn't understand. And that word was Marcel, Marcel. It's a person's name, a very common name here in Switzerland, actually. And I found myself reading Marcel. What does that mean? Marcel. And about the third time, Marcel. And then I realized I had problems with certain words. Let's say where the pattern, as you know, when we read, we don't really look at every letter. So through, thought, trough, words with similar patterns, I was having to think consciously about the context of that word if I was reading something, and on which word it was, which is completely stupid when you think about it. But then I realized that the linguistic center of my brain had been affected, and it still is today. So if I write an email, I write, I will check it more than I used to. I think anybody who doesn't check what they write is an idiot. Sorry. So you should check it at least once.
Thank you.
But, I found myself checking it 3 times. When I look back at some of the texts I sent, which I still got WhatsApps on my phone when I was in hospital, I'm surprised at how few errors there were actually, but missing out a word completely. And yeah. I'll give, if I may, I'll give you a bizarre example. Later, when I was back at work, we had decided to give me less responsibility in the business and to hire a successor, because I'm just about now going to retire fully. And we had a meeting with I'm in IT, and we do we do software projects. We implement software throughout our companies. And I had to introduce the guy who was taking over my department. And his name is Maxime. And I introduced him as Sasha. Now, I know 2 Sashas. They don't look anything like him. Totally bizarre. Where the hell does that come from? And people looked at me like really weird. Are you drunk, or what's going on? And then we had a good laugh, and actually very kindly, he adopted Sasha as his nickname. So we know him in the company. The people that work closely to him refer to him as Sasha. But it was just bizarre things like that. And that still happens. I will use the wrong word and have no clue. So I left the hospital with a vision problem and an awareness that I had these linguistic problems. All the tests I had, I passed quite well. And mathematics and, on-screen testing, hand-eye coordination, everything was pretty good. But I left hospital after 6 days with still a vision problem and with this linguistic problem, and the vision got better after 2 or 3 weeks, but the linguistic problem is still there from time to time. Fred, oh, sorry, it's Bill. Yeah, you know.
Yeah, I understand. I got left with, I struggle with where, and where.
Yeah.
And sometimes I can spend way too long on trying to work out when to use which word. And then other times I won't spend any time on it and I'll completely get it wrong. And I've done it a fair few times on Instagram where I ask questions of people and I'll use the wrong where, and then I'll post it. And then my wife will notice it after I've posted it. But 10 people have responded to my question, and then I can't take it down. And I've got to leave it there.
Yeah, sure. And I think the other thing is that in today's world, especially with autocorrect,
sometimes it gets
which probably should switch off, because the autocorrect, I wrote to someone the other day and didn't notice in a WhatsApp. I basically wrote a sentence that was pretty much nonsense. Who didn't understand, and I wasn't careful enough checking it. So then there are some things also long term which could possibly be a result of having a stroke, but where no one's really willing to sort of nail it down and say that's absolutely because you had a stroke. And that is when I go walking, or when I went walking originally, and in the back of where I used to live, it was very nice hills and woods. Go up there, and I started to be more breathless. And then they did an angiogram, and I think the cardiologist in my hospital, I had to go somewhere else for the angiogram for whatever reason. The cardiologist in my hospital thought that, he's going to find clogged arteries and they were going to put a stent in or something straight away. Actually, it turned out that I was in quite good shape, much to my surprise and amazement for someone who's overweight, and at that time still middle-aged. But they didn't really find anything wrong. But the cardiologist at that hospital said to me he'd had a number of stroke patients who had similar experiences, where he believed it was to do with the dilation of the capillary arteries in the lungs, and they needed some help so that you didn't get breathless. And I've had medication since then, and sometimes for no apparent reason this kind of challenge in breathing pops up. But my rehab lady really showed me some deep breathing exercises that help me get more oxygen even when I'm walking around, So as a result of the stroke, it's impacted your ability to take a proper breath? Is it a neurological issue? I think that no one knows, and I wouldn't say that I know better than the doctors. Right. If you ask one cardiologist, he would say basically that's rubbish, that could have impacted that. And asking the other cardiologist was the guy who suggested it to me. And I found that there's a lot of research. Interestingly, there's research in Australia about it to try and measure the correlation between these kind of breathing difficulties afterwards for people who've had strokes. So again, and I think I mentioned to you once when we were chatting, I recently had my prescription changed on my right eye, and I've always felt that since the stroke, I didn't see so well in the right, which was the one that was affected immediately. And actually, the strange thing is when the opticians measured it, or the eye doctor measured it, didn't find really anything wrong until recently, when they said, there is a weakness there and we have to change prescription.
Yeah. I know that we can't blame everything to the stroke, and it may not be related. The interesting thing, though, is that, the heart beats. The heart is part of the autonomic nervous system in that it beats kind of independently of us. It doesn't really need us to beat. It beats on its own. However, communicates with the rest of the body, and then there's a part in the brain that creates communication between the brain and the heart, and it kind of says, okay, we're beating, and do that. And if that part of the brain is damaged or is not there anymore, then the heart stops. And that's how for some people, brain challenges, whether they are ischemic or hemorrhagic strokes, can cause the heart to stop. So to me, it kind of makes sense that there is a plausibility to your condition that it might be related. But at the same time,
we don't know. We don't know.
Maybe it doesn't matter that you know or don't know.
This is exactly what the cardiologist said, about all these things being linked together, and it could have an impact. And we just like I will never know whether the medication really caused the stroke or not. I will probably never know about the other things. But
one of the things about medication, I know with a lot of my female guests I've had on the show, who have been taking the pill, for a few times, for medical reasons. Some of the ladies are taking it for birth control reasons. And often, and they've had a stroke, for example, and then often they later learn that the birth control medication can potentially put women at greater risk of ischemic stroke. And all of them will go back to their doctors. If they ask the question, the doctor says, look, it's a risk, it's a very low risk and all that type of thing. But again, they just rule out the possibility that it was that or definitely that or something else. But we're talking about young women who are having ischemic stroke.
And let's be honest, if you read every leaflet that comes with every drug that you've ever taken, you never take anything, and you know that there is going to be a risk of side effects, and it's not like the nasty drug companies are making things to make you ill or have strokes. It's just a fact that everybody's different, and like you said, we're totally interrelated, all these systems in the body, and taking medication or a combination of medications can cause problems. So
what was the hardest part of this stroke journey for you to experience?
I think the thing we've already talked about, the fact that other people don't understand that there can be strokes that are less dramatic, that was difficult for people to understand. And like you've mentioned, you have to explain to people what it is, and you have the feeling that they don't treat you the same as they probably would if the half of your body was paralyzed. So we've discussed that. I would say the other thing is, like the anxiety, because it could happen again. I can remember the first time I went home. I had great difficulty in going to sleep because I thought I would never wake up again, and that anxiety stays with you. Tried to address that to a certain extent by having some therapy and learning to do yoga nidra on a regular basis to help you relax and whatever. I think fatigue is one thing, and also probably coping with stress. I gave up some responsibilities, which was exactly the right thing to do. I have still a lot of responsibility, but I found I couldn't deal with stress. And it's interesting that since the stroke, I've had 3 bad instances with atrial fibrillation, where I've had to have a cardioversion, which is they put you out, put a defibrillator on, special one, and give you a shock, kick everything back. And the first time I had that done, of course, I was terrified. When I'd experienced it and had it repeated, I was comfortable with it. But those instances could happen, and when those instances do happen, that then possibly it would, create the right circumstances, conditions to have another stroke. And the interesting thing is those 3 instances, they have always been kind of stress related. One was the day that we moved apartment. Another one was on a very rough flight from the UK back to Zurich. Really bad turbulence, and I was sick, had some sort of flu type thing, and so mostly the AF instances were related to stress. So I haven't had one now in 3 years, but they adjusted my medication. But again, you know, these things are all linked. So you're thinking, if you have one of these instances, you're thinking, you know, now I'm prime territory for a stroke again. So of course that's very worrying. But I'd summarize fatigue, coping with stress, and these long-term linguistic limitations or instances. I think it's been very helpful to talk to other people in support groups and read other people's experiences, because that helps you also understand, you know, you're not alone, and there's thousands, millions of people around the world who have the same experiences. But yeah, I think I've also changed certain things in the way I behave. I'm probably I think I'm probably quite a direct person. I'm also a chatty person, tend to talk too much. But I would say I don't suffer fools gladly. If I see a situation in a conversation in a business or in a meeting, and I see that someone is stressing me out because we're discussing something for the 50th time, then I tend to be less tolerant and just say, come on, look, we've discussed this enough. Let's make a decision. Let's move forward. And I think my threshold, if I'm allowed to say it, my bullshit threshold has changed. It's a lot lower than it used to be.
If you've had a stroke and you're in recovery, you'll know what a scary and confusing time it can be. You're likely to have a lot of questions going through your mind. Like, how long will it take to recover? Will I actually recover? What things should I avoid in case I make matters worse? Doctors will explain things, but obviously you've never had a stroke before. You probably don't know what questions to ask. If this is you, you may be missing out on doing things that could help speed up your recovery. If you're finding yourself in that situation, stop worrying and head to recoveryafterstroke.com, where you can download a guide that will help you. It's called 7 Questions to Ask Your Doctor About Your Stroke. These 7 questions are the ones Bill wished he'd asked when he was recovering from a stroke. They'll not only help you better understand your condition, they'll help you take a more active role in your recovery. Head to the website now, recoveryafterstroke.com, and download the guide. It's free.
You could say that I'm less patient, perhaps, but I just realized every minute that I live is valuable, and going round and round in circles, you know, in a business context is not valuable. Let's get on with it and let's make decisions. And yeah, so that's affected me a little bit, I think, in the way I conduct meetings, because I have to conduct a lot of meetings.
What kind of level is your role at? What?
Well, when I gave up some responsibilities, the responsibility I gave up was people management. So I'm a program manager and have several teams working for me, but they're not people that work for me in a line relationship, people from different teams. So I'm coordinating those projects and guiding people who see something going off track. And also have in that responsibility, we have steering committees with members of our board. So, but I don't know whether that's also getting older and closer to retirement, that you tend to say things that you perhaps wouldn't say in front of board members 10 years or 15 years ago when you wanted to keep your job with the company. But I guess...
Get some feedback from your doctors, see what they think. Maybe it's linked, maybe it's not linked to the stroke.
Yeah, exactly. But I think it's just that you want to get on with things, and you want to keep things straightforward and focused. And of course, you have to do that because you've had a stroke. I don't know whether you've found that you have to focus more when you do something. You know, your attention span can be a problem. Your mind can wander. So you want to try and, because of that, you try and keep everybody else focused. And I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing.
It's definitely, it's all about resources and energy and the lack thereof. And there's not an infinite amount of it. And I, you know, get short towards the end of the day, because towards the end of the day, I'm running low on energy, and it's very different to what it was before my bleeds. You know, until then I could go on and on and on. And after that, I couldn't. I had a clear wall that I would hit. And when I hit it, it was just lights out. So if I needed to get stuff done and you're fluffing around in and getting in my way to get that stuff done before I hit the wall, then I didn't want you to be in my way. I did want to hurry you along. I wanted you out of my way, and I wanted to get to my destination so that when I did hit the wall, I could sit down, rest, recuperate, and get ready for the next day. So a lot of other stroke survivors report that they don't suffer falls as much as they would have previously. And they also report that whole, well, perhaps that lack of patience, but I think it's more fine-tuned than being impatient. I think it's them being totally aware of the fact that they're running out of resources, and that interaction is chewing up valuable resource, and I need to keep moving. And I think the more we get better at talking to other people about our stroke and telling them what happened to us and how we're different compared to them, or how it's changed, I think we could get away with decreasing the amount of time it takes to get to the next part of the conversation, and most people will come on board and they'll appreciate that. But if you're also coming across differently and people are experiencing differently, that might set other people off to think, oh, Peter's being a bit of an ass. Or
yes, absolutely.
Did you get any of that pushback? Did people misinterpret your lack of time with them as you having changed as a result of your stroke? Or
I think that you know, one incident the incidents that I can remember very clearly was that, of course, I'm talking in two languages, so if I'm talking in German, maybe I have more of a struggle to find a word. But I had people finishing sentences for me, and that just really annoyed me and pissed me off, to be honest. And I remember saying once to quite senior people, hey, please just give me a few more seconds to think and process, and don't finish off my sentences. But I know that a bad habit I had before the stroke was sometimes finishing off other people's sentences, not people who have had strokes. So yeah, I think fundamentally you're not changed. And I have to say, and this may sound weird, but there are some benefits, because I found when I had the stroke and was going through recovery, I learned from the professionals that I was working with, but also from studying and reading much more about the way that the mind works. And that was a curious thing, but we take it for granted. And suddenly you start to think more about mind and emotions and that kind of thing, and how that's all connected. I don't know whether other people experience it, but right after the stroke, I found that my dreams, I was very often dreaming about my late childhood, formative years. You know, they talk about when you die, your life flashes past before you, and it was almost like when you have some kind of trauma, that you have a similar thing and you dream about when you were younger. And I think one thing that's very important, and was when I think during the pandemic, I said to my doctor, I said, look, I've had no assessment, I've had no follow-up. I had 9 months of going to a rehab place. We're lucky to have a very good one close to us. People come from all over the world. 7:30 on a Monday morning, I went there on my way to work, spent an hour with my therapist. She was excellent. And I kept, suddenly at the end of the year, it's like, okay, the health insurance is, you've recovered. You don't need that anymore. And then after a couple of years, I was asking my doctor, hey, isn't someone going to do some kind of assessment to see, what's going on? And he sent me to a psychiatrist who, the first meeting, said, I can't believe they haven't done an assessment on you. And he sent me to a neurophysiologist, and I spent a day with her doing all these kind of tests. And what was encouraging was I had a kind of benchmark. She said, a lot of things for your age, you're better than average. There's a lot that's in the zone for your age, and there are one or two things, like particularly hand-eye coordination, which I've never been good at, which scores are a bit low. But that gave me kind of a benchmarking, because I think it's very difficult for you yourself to judge, where you are in the journey. You need something to hold up, like a map, and say, okay, I'm there, I'm there, and there. And that was really useful. But this neuropsychologist, she said, has anybody ever talked to you about post-traumatic stress disorder? And I looked at her like, you crazy? I'm not a Vietnam vet. I wasn't in Afghanistan having to deal with IEDs the whole time. And she said, when you have a stroke, when you have a heart attack, when you have something like that, it's a trauma, a significant trauma. And you need to do things in the therapy that also help you cope with that trauma, which was actually how I ended up doing yoga nidras. She sent me to someone to do wellness-based stress reduction. And she said, people who have strokes, people who have heart attacks, people who have terrible car accidents, there are a lot more people who are traumatized than anybody realizes. And so that was actually helpful to understand that, and that certain of these behavioral things were very typical.
My wife would say after the second bleed, I couldn't finish sentences. I was vague a lot of the time. I'd start a sentence and then not even know what I was talking about. I couldn't type an email. I couldn't do calculations. There's so many things that I couldn't do after the second bleed. And I had a counseling session with my then psychologist, and she said, has anyone suggested a neuropsychologist? And I said, no, I don't know what that is. And it was because of her that I then went and asked for an appointment with a neuropsych.
Yeah.
And that's the only reason why I got one and followed up. And it was, and like you, it seemed like it wasn't even worth mentioning to me. It wasn't a priority for my doctors to allocate me one or to make an appointment for one, but they also didn't feel the need to tell me. And I'm not sure why that is, because I clearly struggled with a lot of things after that second bleed, and for many, many months. Nonetheless, I went to the neuropsych, and it's exactly the relief that I got. I got to learn where I was at, and then I got to be able to reflect. And my counselor, my psychologist, would say to me, hey, also, do you remember when you came in last time, you couldn't complete a sentence, or you couldn't do this, or you didn't do that? And now you're doing that really well. And that might be 3 or 4 sessions down. So she was doing a lot of that, reminding me of how far I'd come, as well as my wife and all the other people that were around me. But you have to, and how do you know? I mean, and you also got a brain that's dealing with stroke recovery. How do you know to be your own self-advocate? But you do have to be your own.
I think that's self-advocate. That's you have to. You can't just sit back and say, I'm surrounded by these people and they're going to take me along the journey. You have to get the map and get the compass and point your feet in the right direction. I think one of the things that I've learned is that it was important for me to take over control of the recovery process. And not rely on other people. Now, you could say, well, that's a weakness with the healthcare or something. The healthcare is excellent in Switzerland. But it's your brain, it's your mind, and you need to take control and talk to the right people and do things. But you also have to listen, to your partner and close friends and people like that who say, don't push yourself. I don't know, you know a lot of people in the groups. I mean, I was saying to someone the other day, I've never been a sporty person, though I love sport and I love football. And I used to coach it. I see people who've had a stroke and suddenly they're doing half marathons and marathons, and they're swimming across the English Channel, and they're doing all these kinds of stuff. And I understand that, because it's doing these physical things is a confirmation back to them that they're recovering and going in the right direction. But sometimes you think, you just need to rest a little bit and relax and not do so much. And that's sometimes the message I've had from other people. When my wife says that you don't have to do that now. You're not feeling that great, because I had a bad virus over the summer, wasn't COVID. And after that, an infection. Give yourself a break, give yourself time. Probably with the fatigue, like you mentioned, later in the day, you can't do so much. So schedule your key activities for the times when you're at peak performance, but give yourself a break as well. And I think we want to reassure ourselves that we've got back to normal, or as close as we can, and probably we push ourselves too far.
I couldn't agree with you more. Look, I've interviewed people that become ultra marathon runners. Episode 130, I interviewed Andy Dobinson, and he got into ultra marathon running, so more than 40 kilometers in one day, and just absolutely thrives on it and loves it. And it's where he finds his meditation time. It's where he uses all the skills to overcome the pain and suffering that he's feeling in his muscles. It's helping him mentally, physically, emotionally, and all power to him. But I tell you what, I could not think of anything worse. Now, maybe Andy hasn't got some of the deficits that I've been left with. So, running is definitely difficult for me, and I don't feel comfortable running. So all power to him. But I felt like also telling Andy, just rest up a little more. Maybe it's helping him avoid things like post-traumatic stress. So maybe that's why some people are doing it, because I know movement and exercise really does help the brain overcome, help with the managing of post-traumatic stress disorder. I interviewed Dr. John King for episode 162, and he's somebody who deals with post-traumatic stress disorder, not because of a stroke, because of a different life experience. But he talks about the whole process of going through an episode and all the things that help him. And he didn't know how to deal with it. He didn't know how to get help. He didn't know what was happening. It ruined his life. It ruined his marriage. It ruined all these things. And slowly he's had to take control where he could and claw back to a life that was stable, to a job, to all the things that are normal, quote unquote, normal in somebody's life. But again, he didn't come from stroke to post-traumatic stress disorder, but he had to be his own advocate, and he knew what he needed. He also had to have the courage to go and get the help, because if an emotional recovery after stroke, a lot of people won't go and get help. I know men are less likely to go and get help than women. And that's the thing that's going to help your recovery. I spoke about it in the last episode where I did a solo episode, part 2 of my my solo episodes, where specifically I spoke about the possibility that if you're missing out on the emotional recovery from stroke, then you're missing out, in my opinion, on 1/3 of the recovery that's required. Underneath emotions, you can put spiritual, you can put all sorts of different things under that bracket. But if you're doing the physical recovery and you're doing the psychological recovery or the mental recovery, and you're changing the way you're thinking about your life, and you're thinking about, the negative sides, and you're thinking about the future, if you're able to bring that around, but then you're not doing the emotional recovery, which is heart-centered work, then you're going to be kind of behind the eight ball. And if you've never done that kind of work because you never thought you needed to do it, well, here's the time where you really, really need to do it.
Absolutely.
Because stroke is going to test you more than anything. And it's going to bring all those demons that we thought we had covered under or swept under the rug. It's going to bring everything into the...
Yeah, because I think the physical recovery is very measurable. You know, you have metrics. It's very visible. And I think that emotional, psychological recovery is something that's more elusive. It's more difficult to pin down. And I think you're absolutely right. You need to talk to people. You know, I can think of situations where I've, say, just lost it, you know, emotionally and burst out crying and whatever. And you know, my wife would say, well, what's the matter? And I would just say something like, I just can't cope at the moment thinking about that. Because, you know, you have these phases where you are weaker emotionally and psychologically. And okay, I haven't had many physical deficits that I've really had to concentrate on. So I'm very fortunate in that sense. So have concentrated on the other things. But yeah, I think it's the recovery spans a whole lot of areas in your life, doesn't it? And you know, there's lots of different aspects to it, and everybody's different. That's the other thing.
Yeah.
I'm sure there are people who just say, okay, get on with it. I'm more or less okay, and that's it. And there are other people like me who think about things a lot, you know, and think about, you know, where am I, and is that linked to the stroke or not? Of course, we don't want to make our experience a crutch, an excuse for things. But I think it's very important that the wider community has a better understanding of brain injuries. And that's why, you know, I'm happy to come and talk to you.
I appreciate that. And hopefully the people that know you will listen to this and get a better insight as well. And that will be really fantastic. I wanted to ask you about your friend who you know who had a serious stroke. How are you interacting with that person now that you've been on that side of stroke and he's been there? Where are you guys at?
I'm not interacting with him really at all, because his brother is interacting with his friends in social media and email and stuff like that, because as a result of his stroke, and I don't know the exact medical condition, it's kind of, he's 48, it's brought on like an early dementia. So he's not only had terrible physical problems, and he was like the guy who was running half marathons, or he was living in New York. I think he even ran the New York Marathon, and he has really hit him like a railroad train, physically, mentally, or whatever. So I react with his brother. He's a Filipino. He happened to be home visiting when he had the stroke, so at least he's with his family rather than in New York. So I can't interact with him directly, and that's of course frustrating. But the nice thing was he went on Facebook a few weeks ago and wished his mum a happy birthday, and that was the first post probably in 9 months or something.
Yeah.
So I hope that I've helped. You know, his brother asked me a lot of questions, so I've tried to support his brother with some interaction there, because he's really in a tough space, mentally and physically, and making progress but slow. And I think his brother appreciated having someone to talk to or just ask, you know, how did this work for you? How long did it take? And then of course I had to say, look, it's very different, and with your brother, and it's really a lot more serious in many ways, and you have to just stick with it and encourage him and be positive. And I think that hasn't been easy over the months since it happened. But I hope that maybe in the future, as he's able to communicate more, I would love to be able to support him, and have a call with him and just really help him more. But at the moment, that's just not possible.
Sounds like he's still in the very acute stage. So,
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely, yeah.
It might be able to come around a little later. The fact that I've had a stroke and I can answer questions for family members of other people who have had a stroke really is really an amazing thing that's come out of stroke for me. To be able to iterate to them something that they cannot possibly understand in any way unless they have a stroke, which we would prefer they never ever did.
Absolutely.
Is something that's amazing for me. And I really get a lot out of the interactions that I have with people who are desperate, who need some light at the end of the tunnel. And that's what the podcast is about. It's about shedding some light and giving people the before, the middle, and then the after, and then the much after, if that's possible, so that we can offer hope. And then as a result of that, I keep receiving emails from amazing friends who say, "Oh, I read this article and it's related to stroke recovery. Check it out. Tell me what you think." And I just received one yesterday, and one of the ones I received, that it's from an organization called Technology Networks, and they've got a subheading of neuroscience news and research, and it's an online publication. And the article is "Restoring the Gut Wall Could Help Save Brain Function After Stroke." And I get encouraged because now I hear about things and I read things that are related to stroke recovery and improving recovery after stroke via the gut, which is a part of stroke recovery that I've known about for quite some time, but there wasn't a lot of research on. So now I've got this group of people who know me. As soon as they come across something that's stroke related, they share it with me immediately, and I get to increase my database of knowledge and get excited about the possibilities that there's so many people looking at stroke recovery in all these different and amazing ways. And these guys are a team of researchers at Texas A&M University School of Medicine, and they're pioneering research into the connection between stroke-induced gut permeability or leakiness and cognitive impairment. So what they're finding is potentially that people who have a stroke also get impacted at the gut level, and many stroke survivors will report having constipation or having some kind of an impacted bowel after stroke, and not realizing that the two are linked. And then it also brings on gut permeability or leakiness, which is exacerbated by gluten and casein, which is found in milk, and all sorts of other things. And now we actually got the opportunity to support these people because we have this information about a lived experience from stroke, and then we also have I also have this beautiful network of people continuing to update me and inform me of things that I can share with other stroke survivors. So I'm going to make a link so that people can find this article. If they go to recoveryafterstroke.com/episodes, find this episode, and then from there, they'll be able to see the link and read the article. So I get that. That's the good part of stroke. And for me, stroke recovery.
It actually reminded me of something that maybe I can share. When you have a stroke, you go into hospital, of course you want to drink water, and until they know that you can swallow properly, you don't get anything. Well, during the pandemic, I've had a lot of throat problems. And during the pandemic, I went to see a specialist, and he said, at the back of your throat where you have your vocal cords, the vocal cords are supposed to kind of fully close, and they didn't. And although at the time all the checks were done, of course that can be something that's impacted by a stroke. And he said, well, you had a stroke. That could be as a result of that. So who would have ever thought that having persistent and chronic sore throats, which are related to the vocal cords, could have been also a result of the stroke. So I went to gosh, I can't think of the word, but like a therapist who deals with all this, talking and
Speech
singing
therapist.
and speech therapist. Exactly. Sorry, I had the German word in my mind. And went to her during the pandemic, which was very difficult because we're doing all the exercises with the Perspex screen. And then I found, for example, I can talk better. I play the guitar and sing for fun. And I found also doing these exercises that my voice was stronger. So even 2 or 3 years down the line, maybe you trip up over something and it could be related. On the other hand, you don't want to say it every time you're sick or every time something's wrong, that the stroke is to blame. But I think educating people like you just did, these problems with the gut and whatever, we don't want to make them all hypochondriacs, but we want to make them aware that probably having a brain injury has a lot more peripheral damage than perhaps we realize.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, my brain was messed up by the blood clots that were in my head for nearly 3 years before brain surgery. And then it was fiddled with because of brain surgery. They had to go into my head about 4 centimeters deep. So almost to the cerebellum. And they had to go kind of behind my ear and in there, or actually above my ear, and in and down and in. And they would have had to wiggle stuff and push stuff out of the way. I mean, it's been handled and poked and prodded. It makes sense that something that happens under conditions of surgery that's not at the spot of the stroke could impact the way that you experience your body afterwards. I've had a eye condition which I cannot describe, and a doctor and a ophthalmologist can't see it, but I've had this weird kind of flutter in my eye that feels a bit strange, pretty much since the brain surgery, and my entire left side is numb, and I experience it differently to my right side. It's numb. It has pins and needles. It's colder. It has more tension. So it's kind of has a little bit of spasticity, although you can't see it anywhere. And when my eye flutters, I just kind of put it off. I didn't know what it was, and I couldn't get anyone to explain it to me. And then one day, only about 5 or 6 months ago, it occurred to me that it's on the left side of my body, where everything feels different. Yeah. And if my eye feels different, that could explain it. And it isn't, and there isn't anything wrong with my vision or my eyeball, but it just makes this weird thing that I feel from time to time, especially at night. So yeah, it takes a while for things to sink in as well sometimes, that it could be related to the stroke. So I'm nearly 10 years out. I mean, I'm discovering these things all the time. Tomorrow in Australia, it's going to be Friday. It's going to be the 25th of November. And that is the anniversary of my brain surgery in 2014. So, it's been 8 years and I'm still discovering things that I'm going through. And on that note, not only am I discovering things that I'm going through that are related to the stroke, I'm also noticing improvements in my abilities, capabilities. My fatigue levels are decreasing still. My energy levels are increasing still. So I want to share that as well, that 8 years down after stroke surgery, more than 10 years since the first bleed, I'm noticing minor incremental changes for the positive. So
which
hopefully,
is fantastic,
Yeah. And
I can remember in hospital. Yeah, sorry, the neurologist, told me, he said one of the very frustrating things about having a stroke can be that your immediate recovery, like my vision, I couldn't drive straight away. 3 weeks later, I did a test and I was able to drive. So right that weekend after, when I was in the stroke unit, things began to improve. I started watching TV, playing games. And he said one of the frustrating things can be the rate of recovery will go from super fast to very, very slow. And that can be frustrating, and you shouldn't think as someone who's had a stroke or a brain injury that it's going to be like, the brain is rewiring itself like crazy in the first few days, and it's not going to be like that. And I think it's also important, like you just said, dwell on the positive as well, and say, what is good? What can you do now that you couldn't do maybe 6 months, 2 years ago, whatever. Because of my age, I've got the aging process going on, and that's also a challenge, which you think, well, how much of this is just getting older, or if something pops up, how much of it is to do with getting older. And I think that's also a challenge. And yeah, of course, staying positive is very important. It's not always that easy. I'm not a person who is really, how should I put it? I remember years ago when I was a salesperson in the UK, we all had to stand on the desk and say we are the best salesperson in the world. It was one of these rah, rah, rah kind of seminar events. And I just got down off the desk, and then the facilitator said, "How are you all feeling?" And I said, "Well, we can't all be the best salesman in the world. That's mathematically not possible unless we're all equally the same." So, you do have to have a dose of reality and be realistic. But having that positive mindset is also a battle to maintain that. You're going to have your good days, you're going to have your bad days. And I think that's where we can gain support from the community and people who've had similar experiences.
Yeah, to help bring you out of one of those difficult days. Like, positive mindset is not a permanent thing. It's hopefully a positive mindset is something that you do more often than not, but really recognize that it's okay to not have a positive mindset as well, because you've got to go through the gamut of emotions and mindset, feelings, and you've got to go through it all. You've got to have the ups and you've got to have the downs, and you got to find the balance somewhere in your own experience, because having a positive mindset all the time is not viable. It's absolutely not doable, because stroke causes.
Yeah, you're allowed to have a bad. Yeah, exactly. You're allowed to have a bad day as well. I think that's sometimes you have a bad day. Don't do anything. Read a book.
Yeah.
Play guitar, listen to music, whatever it is. Watch some crap movie. Give yourself a break, and you cannot maintain that level of positiveness, if there's such a word. Yeah, there is positivity. The whole time, and if you're trying to try and persuade other people that you're up there the whole time, come on, just get real.
Yeah.
Get real with yourself.
And it's going to set a false expectation. I know there's a lot of people that went back to work too soon that I've interviewed who pretended that everything was okay and there was nothing wrong. And they really struggled to, I don't know, I suppose, keep up appearances and pretend that everything was okay. Yeah. And then only to fall into a heap later, down the track.
Yeah. I mean, I was back at work first of all from home, 50% within 2 weeks. And then I guess probably about after 6 weeks, I was a Monday morning and I had my therapy, and then I agreed to meet my boss. We had a nice relaxing lunch somewhere in the shopping center, and then I went back in the office. And the difference I felt of being back in the office to working from home, I just went, I stayed there about 2 hours and I went home. I could, then I realized it was far too early to go back in the office.
Yeah.
what's nice about the home office, which we've all experienced during the pandemic, is that you can control things better. You know, at that stage, I was very vulnerable. Someone comes into your office, "Do you have 5 minutes, Peter?" And they're there an hour and a half later. And you wanted to get on with something else. You were struggling to stay focused on a particular thing. What's nice about the home office is you can see this person is trying to call you on Teams or whatever, and you can just ignore it. Ignore it and finish what you're doing, stay focused, and then call that person back. Because I think that when you've had a brain injury, what's very important is being organized, certain, let's say, what's the word? The patterns of doing things, they're really helpful to you. At least I find that they're very helpful to you. And, you know, when you're a home office environment, you have much more control over that. Whereas, you know, you're back in the office and then, of course, especially because you have this invisible brain injury, then people, I thought you were going to be sort of limping along or something like that. And then because people see that you appear to be normal, they interact with you normally, but you're not ready for it, actually. And that's, I think that's absolutely important. You know, make these small steps, going back into your work environment. Don't do it all at once.
Through just sheer ignorance, you know, I had those experiences. Oh, you look fine. And it used to annoy me at the beginning, listening to somebody say, you look fine. Well, I used to get annoyed at that person for being ignorant about stroke and what stroke feels like. Well, it's like, come on. Then I had to be okay with the fact that they were ignorant. That's how they were meant to be. They couldn't possibly know what it's like to have had a stroke. But I do love that opportunity that you had to do part of your transition back to work from home in an environment that you could control, when you stopped for a quick rest, or when you were overwhelmed, or you can control the lighting, the noise. You didn't have to travel and therefore get fatigued in the task of traveling to work and then having to try and find a way home. You know, that's a really lovely, what's the word? It's a very lovely transition back.
Yeah. You know, and we're fortunate in our company. We have a quiet room, which has, you know, where you can lie down with your head slightly raised. And when I did go back in, I found that was very good after lunch to just be able to go there for 30 minutes, lie down, so I say meditate, you know, but just be quiet, not go to sleep necessarily, but relax. And I found that really invigorated me to cope with the rest of the day. So I've found I've kept that habit of having short, relaxing breaks, or especially after lunch. And I even noticed that if I don't have that after lunch power nap, meditation break, whatever you want to call it, and whatever you want to do, that I struggle then more as the day goes by. So I think it's really good to do that. And I tell you what's great, doing that and having that quiet time is usually where I get the best ideas and creative ideas, or solving a problem. Suddenly it will come to me, oh yeah, we could do that. And you know, I think we all rehearse things in our minds. We have a playbook in our minds if something's coming up, a meeting or something like that. And those periods of quiet, especially, I think if you've had a brain injury, are really valuable. They're like recharging, but also, you know, you get a dose of creativity. I mean, I get my best ideas when I wake up to go to the toilet. It's 3 o'clock in the morning. I've always kind of had that. It's weird, isn't it? Because when you're able to relax and you know, it's usually then the best. I remember years ago reading about a top UK businessman, and someone said to him in an interview, said, "But you're always on the golf course." He says, whenever we see, you're always on the golf course. He says, I have my best ideas on the golf course. If the people I'm having problems with play golf, I don't play golf. I've given up trying to learn. He says, if the people I'm having problems with play golf, we go out on the golf course and we solve those problems. So just changing the environment. And I'm sure you're going to say the same thing, just going for a walk in the forest, by the lake, on the beach or whatever. Those things are so important. Or go for a walk around the factory at lunchtime outside. Those things are so important and anyway, but they become much more important when you've got a brain injury. And I think most of us who've had that experience, we value more going for a walk, looking at the woods, looking at the lake, whatever. Very important, I think.
The benefits of exercise on the healing brain are just, I've written a whole chapter about it in my book. It's never ending. You could write forever about the benefits to the brain from exercise. And we're talking about mild exercise, even if it's not standing up, even from a wheelchair, anything like that really supports the brain to recover. With regards to what I love is the applying kind of, in my mind, there's I see the stagnation of being stuck in a problem. Usually when there's a problem, if you think about the physiology of most people, when they're in the problem, they're stuck, they're scratching their head, they're not moving, nothing is really turning over. And then when you get them moving and you get them actively kind of getting out of their head, because now they have to do walking and paying attention to, the path or the rocks or whatever, wherever they might be, then you're getting out of the way of, the brain's getting out of the way of itself and then allowing for things to start moving again and for those ideas to emerge or pop up wherever they are living and to come into your awareness so that you can utilize them. I find that in the middle of the night, I get some ideas, etc. And you know how some people will talk about them, they'll say they've got a piece of paper next to their bed and they'll write it down. I've never done that yet. So in the morning, I forget about them and they're gone. And sometimes they reemerge, they pop up. But usually I'm not cognitively awake enough to go, okay, actually what I need to do is go down and write it down. And sometimes if I have gone and written it down, I get too excited about what I just realized, and then I can't go back to sleep.
I'm a musician and I write songs and play the guitar a lot. And after the stroke, probably only a week or so afterwards, I dreamt that I was playing with a band that I played when I was a teenager, or early 20s, probably more accurately. And I actually dreamt some words to a song, and I actually dreamt a guitar riff. And I couldn't be bothered to get up in the night and write that down. So I got up. It was still very present in my mind. But I was hungry, so I had my breakfast, and I, of course, forgot it. But what was interesting is, fortunately, it all came back to me about 10 minutes later, because I remembered enough fragments of it to do it, and then it came flooding back, and that developed into a song. I mentioned earlier about dreaming a lot about my youth immediately after the stroke. So, I think creativity is very important, and whether it's physical exercise, playing golf, playing a musical instrument, whatever it might be, those things are, of course, very, very important for the brain and also for the physical side of it. My first reaction to being told that I had a stroke was, can I play the guitar or not? A year before I injured my arm, and that was exactly the same reaction then. But I was really concerned, and I was thinking, okay, I can move, everything's fine with my hands and whatever. But I was wondering, when I really start to try and play again, is something going to be limited or something? And I was very fortunate not to be. But I think getting away from the normal environment is good.
I did an interview with Vinny Valentino, a very accomplished guitarist in the United States, on episode 168. And he had, yeah, that's a good one. And he had an ischemic stroke, and then he struggled to get back into playing the guitar. He's back there now, but he mentioned that he's not at his best. You know, he doesn't feel like he's at his best like he was previously. But he's managed to rediscover, you know, playing the guitar after the stroke, and it was one of the things he worried about. I also have a friend of mine who's had a stroke, who I met many years ago at the beginning of my journey, who actually was a guitarist and lost the ability to play guitar because of the spasticity on, I think, his left side or his right side. I think his left. And then he took up playing the keyboard one-handed. So you couldn't really stop him from being a musician. He just evolved it and adapted it so they can still play in a band, and he can still perform and write music and do all the things that he loved to do. He's just doing it in a different way.
That's great. Yeah.
Peter, thanks so much for coming onto the podcast. Mostly, thank you for reminding me that I had forgotten to get you on the podcast and to allocate time in my diary and in my calendar. I say that because there'll be people who reached out and want to be on the podcast, probably listening, who I've forgotten to get back to, or in amongst all the messages that I received, I missed on getting back to somewhere. So if you're one of those people and you're listening or watching, reach out and let me know that I've forgotten. I'm very happy to receive your reminder, and we'll do it, and we'll definitely get on the podcast. In the meantime, Peter, I really appreciate your time, and best of luck with your continued recovery. And thanks for choosing to be on here.
Thank you very much, and I appreciate very much what you're doing. You know, I stumbled across somewhere in social media, and I haven't listened to all of your podcasts, but I've certainly listened to some of them, and I think it's very valuable, and I'm sure I'm not the only person who appreciates it. So thank you, and I would say good evening. Now I have to start working.
Yeah, enjoy the rest of your day. Thanks, Peter. Thanks for joining us on today's episode. Sharing the show with family and friends on social media will make it possible for people who may need this type of content to find it easier, and that may make a massive difference to someone that is on the road to recovery after their own experience with stroke. If you are a stroke survivor with a story to share about your experience, come and join me on the show. The interviews are not scripted. You do not have to plan for them. All you need to do to qualify is be a stroke survivor or care for someone who is a stroke survivor, or you are one of the fabulous people that help stroke survivors in their recovery. Go to recoveryafterstroke.com/contact, fill out the form, and as soon as I receive your request, I will respond with more details on how you can choose a time that works for you and me to meet over Zoom. Thanks again for being here and listening. I really appreciate you. See you on the next episode.
Importantly, we present many podcasts designed to give you an insight and understanding into the experiences of other individuals. Opinions and treatment protocols discussed during any podcast are the individual's own experience, and we do not necessarily share the same opinion, nor do we recommend any treatment protocol discussed. All content on this website and any linked blog, podcast, or video material controlled this website or content is created and produced for informational purposes only and is largely based on the personal experience of Bill Gasiamis. The content is intended to complement your medical treatment and support healing. It is not intended to be a substitute for professional medical advice and should not be relied on as health advice. The information is general and may not be suitable for your personal injuries, circumstances, or health objectives. Do not use our content as a standalone resource to diagnose, treat, cure, or prevent any disease for therapeutic purposes or as a substitute for the advice of a health professional. Never delay seeking advice or disregard the advice of a medical professional. professional, your doctor, or your rehabilitation program based on our content. If you have any questions or concerns about your health or medical condition, please seek guidance from a doctor or other medical professional. If you are experiencing a health emergency or think you might be, call 000 if in Australia, or your local emergency number immediately for emergency assistance, or go to the nearest hospital emergency department. Medical information changes constantly. While we aim to provide current, quality information in our content, we do not provide any guarantees and assume no legal liability or responsibility for the accuracy, currency, or completeness of the content. If you choose to rely on any information within our content, you do so solely at your own risk. We are careful with links we provide. However, third-party links from our website are followed at your own risk, and we are not responsible for any information you find there.